An empty leather armchair stands frozen inside a ghostly wheelhouse, 36 meters beneath the ice of Lake Superior. On a perfectly calm, starlit night, an exhausted officer sat in this very seat and closed his eyes for just a moment. That single, silent lapse left a 160-meter steel fortress drifting completely blind into the dark. What happened next was a 20-minute descent into pure, absolute terror. Steel was torn open like paper, turning the deep engine rooms into an inescapable death trap. Yet, the most disturbing part of this tragedy isn't the crew that went missing, or the deceptive stillness of the water that night. It is the chilling, unexplained anomaly that modern divers still find waiting for them when they breach the sunken hull today. What dark secrets did this vessel carry to the bottom? And what is still lurking inside its frozen iron walls? The answer isn't just hidden in historical records, it is etched into the twisted steel waiting at the bottom. Stay with me until the very end to find out what truly lies beneath the dual curse of Canoe Rocks. At the remote northeastern tip of Isle Royale, a massive, isolated island wilderness surrounded by the freezing depths of northern Superior, lies a treacherous geological formation known as Canoe Rocks. Canoe Rocks is not a towering, visible cliffside. It is a series of razor-sharp, volcanic basalt reefs that lurk mere inches beneath the undulating surface of the water, making them completely invisible to the naked eye of a lookout standing on a ship's bow. As the deep blue of the open lake masks the jagged stone until the very millisecond a ship's hull slams into it. This environment gave rise to a cruel, localized axiom well known among veteran freshwater mariners. Lake Superior does not need a storm to kill you. The lake is a patient executioner that waits for the inevitable frailty of the human component. In these waters, absolute tranquility possesses a unique, deadly toxicity because it breeds a false sense of security that can lure even the most seasoned crews into an irreversible trap. In 1947, as both the United States and Canada were caught in an aggressive post-war economic boom, creating an insatiable, non-stop demand for steel to rebuild global infrastructure. Shipping companies like Canada Steamship Lines responded by forcing their fleets into relentless, punishing schedules that pushed both machines and men to their absolute breaking points. The vessel steaming directly into this high-pressure operational trap was the SS Emperor, a true Leviathan of the inland seas. Measuring an impressive 525 feet in length, she had long earned the prestigious title of the Pride of Canada. When she was officially launched from the bustling shipyards of Collingwood, Ontario in 1910, she held the historic distinction of being the largest commercial cargo vessel ever designed and constructed within the borders of the Dominion of Canada. Yet, for all her size and structural might, the SS Emperor was never invincible. Her long history on the Great Lakes was mapped out by a series of precise mechanical failures and narrow escapes that served as quiet, technical foreshadowings of her ultimate ruin. The fragile boundary between survival and disaster had been tested from the very beginning of her career. Immediately following her sea trials in Georgian Bay off Collingwood, she embarked on her maiden voyage on the 3rd of May 1911, sailing upbound without cargo. Just 2 weeks later, on May 17, while navigating Lake Huron, her operational life was abruptly halted when she suffered a fractured propeller shaft in Thunder Bay. Left entirely disabled, she had to be towed to Detour, Michigan, by the freighter Superior and subsequently brought to Port Arthur, Ontario, for dry dock, repairs, and early indication of the vulnerabilities inherent in her heavy propulsion systems. Later that same year, on the 18th of October 1911, a spectacular administrative and operational failure nearly claimed the vessel inside the Canadian lock at Sault Ste. Marie. Laden with 310,000 bushels of wheat en route from Fort William to Midland, the Emperor was temporarily under the command of her first mate, while Captain George Pearson was ashore. In a disastrous lapse of protocol, the canal gate tenders prematurely flooded the lock chamber before the Emperor could signal her readiness with a whistle blast. The violent, surging torrent of water tore the freighter from her mooring lines and propelled her out of the lock at high speed. The mate ordered the anchors dropped, but the shallow depth caused the vessel to override her own ground tackle, tearing a massive hole in her bottom plating. The Emperor sank into 20 feet of water, just 400 feet below the lower entrance, blocking the entire canal. Her stern smashed heavily against the north pier, while her bow swung 100 feet into the main channel. Though she was successfully raised and temporarily repaired, a formal inquiry by Dominion Wreck Commissioner L.A. Demers laid the entire blame on the canal staff for their reckless water management. As the vessel transitioned into the fleet of Canada's steamship lines, her heavy ore transport routes across the lakes exposed her to repeated grounding incidents. On the 29th of May 1914, she ran hard aground on Pointe Pin along the northern coast of Lake Erie, requiring a combined rescue effort by the tugs Hackett and James Reed to pull her free the following day. On the 29th of October 1926, she struck Major Shoal near Mackinaw City, Michigan, and was only freed after her crew jettisoned 886 long tons of raw iron ore into the lake to lighten her draft. This was followed by yet another grounding prior to 1932, when she struck an unidentified underwater obstruction near Michipicoten Island while bound for Fort William. The most terrifying precursor to her eventual loss occurred during the late shipping season on the 24th of November 1936. Loaded with 8,858 long tons of coal and battling a violent autumn gale between Passage Island and Lamb Island on Lake Superior, the Emperor suffered a catastrophic structural failure when her massive rudder was completely torn away by heavy seas. The iron-laden, unsteerable giant wallowed helplessly, drifting at the mercy of the freezing storm throughout the entire day of November 25. The severe rolling of the dead ship turned tragic when a rogue wave swept one of her sailors directly into the open lake, where he drowned. She was narrowly saved from an early grave by the arrival of the canal tug Renvoil, which secured a tow line and laboriously dragged the crippled freighter into Fort William just as the tug James Whalen was arriving to assist. Even in calmer waters, navigation errors plagued the vessel. On the 4th of May 1937, while carrying iron ore from Ashland, Wisconsin, to Hamilton, Ontario, thick fog blinded her bridge crew on Lake Ontario. Missing her vital turn toward the Burlington Canal piers, the Emperor continued blindly forward until she plowed into the shallows near Bronte, Ontario at 11:00 p.m. She was only refloated on May 6, after the tug Rival and the barge Londonderry lightered a significant portion of her mineral cargo. 3 years later, in the spring of 1940, her vulnerability was highlighted on a human level when first mate James A. Maury fell directly over the side from one of her bridge wings, narrowly escaping serious injury or drowning in the cold waters. Every single one of these historical events did not occur in a vacuum. They were explicit, blood-stained red flags ignored by Canada's steamship lines and a complacent maritime industry. When the SS Emperor was officially launched from the bustling shipyards of Collingwood, Ontario in 1910, she was heralded across North America as a magnificent triumph of industrial muscle, a 525-foot fortress of steel engineered exclusively to fulfill the demands of raw economic efficiency. This unprecedented efficiency was entirely driven by her highly specialized arch and web frame construction system, a breakthrough in early 20th century naval architecture designed to maximize cargo volume while minimizing structural deadweight. By utilizing massive transverse web frames and heavy, overarching steel deck arches rather than relying on the traditional, closely spaced vertical pillars that historical cargo vessels required, the ship's designers succeeded in creating an unprecedentedly vast, completely unobstructed internal cargo hold. This design innovation allowed shoreside clamshell buckets and massive gravity-fed chutes to load and unload thousands of tons of bulk material at blistering, record-breaking speeds, completely eliminating the structural obstructions that typically slowed down port turnarounds. Yet, this exact structural triumph harbored a catastrophe. To maximize every single available square inch of cargo space for corporate profit, the SS Emperor was built completely devoid of robust, longitudinal, watertight bulkheads that could isolate her internal spaces during an emergency, and she featured a highly vulnerable, unified, and continuous ballast tank system. Her 7 massive ballast tanks, running continuously along the sides and throughout the double bottom, were structurally interconnected with one another, rather than being individually compartmentalized or isolated by watertight boundaries. For nearly 4 decades, however, this inherent structural vulnerability remained completely hidden beneath a flawless veneer of reliable, uninterrupted service. The SS Emperor spent 37 long years operating with the relentless precision of an industrial clock, moving millions of tons of coal, grain, and iron ore to fuel the aggressive industrial expansion of North America through 2 world wars and the Great Depression. By the time the sweltering summer of 1947 arrived, a deeply dangerous sense of complacency had taken firm root across the entire maritime community of the Great Lakes. The relentless, rhythmic precision of the shipping schedules post-World War II had created a powerful collective delusion among inland mariners, a false, unshakable belief that the volatile, historically deadly waters of Lake Superior had finally been permanently tamed by modern steel hulls, standardized routes, and mechanical routine. In 1947, both the United States and Canada were locked in an aggressive, insatiable post-war economic boom, creating a desperate, non-stop market thirst for raw steel to rebuild war-torn global infrastructure and feed domestic automotive and manufacturing industries. Shipping conglomerates, including the Emperor's corporate operator, Canada Steamship Lines, responded to this high-stakes market pressure by forcing their aging fleets into relentless, punishing turnarounds that deliberately squeezed every second out of the shipping season. On the 3rd of June 1947, crushing corporate pressure pushed the SS Emperor and her crew to a fatal breaking point at Thunder Bay, Ontario. The grueling ordeal began at Fort William, where the men endured backbreaking, coal dust-choked labor to discharge their cargo. Without a moment to rest, the exhausted crew was immediately ordered across the harbor to Port Arthur. There, under the strict eyes of company schedulers demanding a fast turnaround, the ship underwent a punishing, non-stop 6 to 7 hour bulk loading operation. Gravity chutes force-fed 10,400 tons of heavy iron ore into her open, uncompartmentalized holds. Driven by aggressive post-war cost-cutting, Canada Steamship Lines forced the vessel to sail shorthanded, completely lacking a third mate. Consequently, the high-stakes burden of supervising the entire loading process fell squarely on First Mate James A. Maury. While others caught staggered intervals of sleep, Maury worked continuously through the port, monitoring mooring lines, calculating stability, and managing the weight of the incoming ore. By the time the hatches were secured, Maury had been performing intense physical labor and high-stress mental calculations for nearly 20 consecutive hours without a single minute of sleep. At exactly 22:55, on the night of the 3rd of June 1947, the heavily laden SS Emperor finally cast off her lines from Port Arthur and weighed anchor directly into the open, freezing waters of Lake Superior. Captain Eldon Walkinshaw took his commanding position on the bridge, confidently navigating the heavily laden Leviathan out of the harbor channels and setting her initial navigational course designed to clear the rocky, wilderness coast of Isle Royale. The captain remained actively at the helm for the first hour of the voyage, verifying headings and ensuring the massive ship safely cleared the immediate coastal hazards of the bay before the open water was reached. At the stroke of midnight, as the calendar turned to June 4, the fatal handoff of operational command occurred. Captain Walkinshaw, satisfied that the ship was on a safe and standard trajectory, retired to his private quarters to sleep, transferring absolute command of the bridge and the safety of the vessel to the severely exhausted First Mate James A. Maury for the notorious midnight watch. Maury stepped onto the bridge already trapped in a state of advanced clinical sleep deprivation, his mind deeply clouded by cognitive fatigue and his neurological reflexes completely shattered by the grueling hours of continuous labor spent under the loading chutes at Port Arthur. Standing directly beside the incapacitated first mate at the heavy wooden ship's wheel was wheelsman J. Prokop. Prokop was a newly hired hand on the Emperor, an inexperienced wheelsman. As the silent hours ticked slowly by in the dimly lit, rhythmically vibrating wheelhouse, the SS Emperor began to slowly, invisibly drift off her designated safe course due to the subtle pressure of the water currents, inching closer and closer with every passing minute toward the submerged basalt teeth of Isle Royale. Prokop blindly and mechanically maintained the exact compass heading he had been given at the start of the watch, entirely unaware that the massive ship was steaming at full operational speed into a lethal geological trap. Even as the hours progressed and the distant warning lights on the horizon began to shift into highly irregular, dangerous configurations that should have triggered immediate alarm bells for any seasoned mariner, Prokop remained completely silent at his post. Meanwhile, the single man who was legally and operationally tasked with actively verifying their position, cross-referencing charts, and ensuring the survival of the vessel was completely and utterly incapacitated by his own exhausted physiology. Rather than continuously cross-referencing the visible navigation lights on the horizon, plotting regular compass bearings on the chart table, and actively correcting their trajectory around the treacherous, rocky periphery of Isle Royale, First Mate James A. Maury had hit his absolute physical breaking point. The sheer, unyielding weight of 20 continuous hours of sleep deprivation completely crushed his remaining consciousness. Lookouts and deckhands passing by the windows of the wheelhouse during the quiet watch observed a chilling, haunting sight through the glass. The first mate sat entirely motionless, his body completely limp and his head slumped heavily forward against his chest in the depths of the leather armchair. At exactly 4:15 a.m. on the 4th of June, 1947, while traveling at its maximum operational cruising speed of over 10 knots, the massive and heavily laden bulk freighter SS Emperor drove its monumental steel bow straight into the jagged, razor-sharp basalt reef of Canoe Rocks. The sheer kinetic energy of 10,000 400 tons of dense industrial iron ore, combined with the immense deadweight of the 525-foot steel hull slamming into a solid, unyielding underwater ridge, created a catastrophic, ground-shaking impact that reverberated through the entire structure of the vessel. The heavy outer steel plating of the ship's forward section was instantly torn open like a sheet of fragile paper, buckling, tearing, and shearing violently as the jagged, prehistoric stone teeth of the reef ground their way deep into the vessel's belly. The structural trauma inflicted upon the ship was immediate, devastating, and fundamentally fatal. Because the aging vessel had been engineered with an uncompartmentalized arch and web frame layout, completely lacking robust, longitudinal watertight bulkheads, and featured a unified, interconnected ballast tank system, there were absolutely no internal engineering defenses or structural boundaries to contain the invading lake water. A massive, high-pressure, and completely unstoppable torrent of freezing water flooded the entire forward third of the vessel in a matter of heartbeats, rapidly expanding through the interconnected bottom tanks and overwhelming the open cargo spaces, while the severely crushed and lacerated bow section became immovably pinned, wedged, and held high upon the shallow, jagged ridge of the Canoe Rocks reef. The massive stern section, weighted down by the immense, shifting, and concentrated dead weight of the industrial iron ore cargo, hung precariously suspended over the edge of a steep, deep underwater drop-off. As the uncompartmentalized aft spaces and the cargo hold rapidly filled with thousands of gallons of incoming water, the stern grew exponentially heavier by the second, beginning a rapid, terrifying, and agonizing plunge into the 120-foot dark abyss lurking directly behind the reef. This catastrophic leverage point, with the bow pinned high and the stern dragging downward into the depths, began to twist, bend, and violently fracture the ship's massive steel midsection. Below decks, the deep, cavernous engine rooms, boiler spaces, and crew quarters instantly transformed into pitch-black, chaotic death traps. The violent, shuddering shockwave of the initial impact, combined with the sudden, incredibly steep tilt of the floorboards, jolted the sleeping crew members awake into a disorienting nightmare filled with rushing water, bursting pipes, escaping steam, and the deafening screech of structural steel being torn apart under physics-defying structural stresses. In the immediate face of total annihilation, Chief Engineer Merritt Deadman, a highly disciplined, deeply knowledgeable, and seasoned veteran of the Great Lakes shipping lanes, demonstrated exemplary heroism under pressure. The exact moment the catastrophic impact occurred, without waiting for an official command from the confused bridge or the delayed sounding of the general alarm, Deadman instinctively and selflessly ran straight into the bowels of the rapidly flooding engine room. Recognizing with expert precision that the ship's electrical power grid and steam generation systems were the only active lifelines available to buy his desperate shipmates precious minutes to organize an escape, he courageously stood his ground amidst blinding clouds of escaping superheated steam and the rapidly rising, freezing lake water. He manually operated the valves, stabilized the generators, and managed the critical machinery under life-threatening conditions until the very last possible second, ensuring the lights stayed on as long as possible. Up on the high bridge, Captain Eldon Walkinshaw rushed from his private quarters into a scene of absolute, unmitigated ruin and panic. Instantly assessing the steep angle of the deck and the rapid, vertical sinking of the weighted stern, he recognized that the vessel was completely lost and immediately issued the definitive, harrowing order to abandon ship. Captain Walkinshaw completely and utterly abdicated any thoughts of his own personal survival. He ran frantically along the steeply slanting, slippery, and wave-washed decks through the dark morning air, shouting into the crew quarters to rouse trapped men guiding disoriented crew members through the darkness toward the lifeboats and manually assisting his sailors into the survival craft. He remained actively on the breaking, disintegrating hull, selflessly coordinating the evacuation until the rising, freezing waters of Lake Superior finally claimed the very deck beneath his feet, choosing to go down into the abyss with the pride of Canada. The frantic, desperate rush to evacuate the dying vessel soon devolved into an entirely new layer of horror and tragedy as the terrified crew attempted to launch the ship's lifeboats into the pitch-black night. Due to the extreme, rapid list of the vessel, only 2 survival craft were successfully cleared and lowered into the water, and each faced a drastically different, horrifying fate. The starboard lifeboat crew managed to successfully clear the side of the sinking hull, but the moment the small craft hit the water, the sailors discovered to their horror that it was severely damaged, cracked, and leaking. Freezing lake water rushed in through the compromised seams of the boat, forcing the panicked, shivering sailors to stand uncomfortably up to their knees in ice-cold water, continuously and desperately bailing out the lake with whatever small containers and boots they could find in the dark, just to prevent their only refuge from foundering and sliding beneath the surface. Meanwhile, the port lifeboat faced an even more violent, instantaneous catastrophe. As the crew members lowered the boat down the slanting side of the hull, the massive SS Emperor began its final, rapid, and near-vertical plunge into the deep lake. The sudden, violent displacement of thousands of tons of heavy steel sinking rapidly into the deep water generated a massive, irresistible, and terrifying hydrodynamic suction vortex. This powerful downward rush of water caught the fragile port lifeboat, violently pulling it back against the crushing steel side of the hull, flipping it completely upside down in a flash, and ruthlessly tossing all of its occupants directly into the freezing, pitch-black water, forcing them to swim for their lives amidst floating debris. Amidst this chaotic, swirling horror was 18-year-old Ernest Alrek, the youngest, newest, and most inexperienced deckhand aboard the vessel. Despite his youth and lack of historical experience with disaster, Alrek displayed incredible survival instincts and maturity during the heights of the panic. He managed to grab a life jacket through the dark and actively assisted his older crewmates in clearing the lines and launching the lifeboats into the waves. However, before he could safely climb into a boat himself, a massive, breaking wave washed completely across the sinking deck, violently throwing his young body over the side and into the sub-freezing lake. Plunged deep into the dark, numbing water, Alrek resurfaced and swam desperately through the choking debris, eventually managing to claw his way over to the overturned port lifeboat. He clung onto the slippery, inverted keel with all his remaining physical strength, his hands being severely crushed. Lacerated and bloodied in the desperate, terrifying scramble to maintain his grip against the washing waves and the biting wind. From the initial moment of impact on the basalt reef at 4:15 a.m. to the final echoing structural groan of the hull as the stern tore away completely and slid down the underwater drop-off to the lake bed, the entire historical event lasted a mere 20 to 35 minutes. The United States Coast Guard cutter USCGC Kimball happened to be actively conducting a routine, regularly scheduled patrol mission in the immediate geographic vicinity of Isle Royale that morning. The vigilant watchstanders aboard the Kimball intercepted the frantic distress signals and noticed the sudden, ominous disruption of lights on the horizon. The commanding officers immediately ordered full emergency speed, and the rescue cutter sliced through the waves, reaching the chaotic, debris-strewn waters of Canoe Rocks exactly 25 minutes after the SS Emperor had completely disappeared beneath the surface. The scene that greeted the Coast Guard rescue crew as they illuminated the coordinates with their powerful searchlights was a haunting, unforgettable tableau of maritime survival. The brilliant beams of light cut through the cold morning mist to reveal a scattered, desperate struggle for life. Men standing knee-deep in a half-submerged starboard boat, terrified sailors clinging to the slippery hull of the overturned port boat with crushed, bleeding fingers like young Ernest Ulrich, and a small, shivering group of shock-ridden survivors who had managed to crawl directly onto the jagged, exposed rocks of the Canoe Rocks reef itself. The rescue operation was executed with blistering speed and precision, pulling the freezing men and women directly from the jaws of the lake. The definitive consensus among both the surviving crew and the official Coast Guard investigators was absolutely unanimous. The margins between life and death that morning were razor thin. If the USCGC Kimball had arrived even 10 minutes later than she did, the merciless, numbing effect of severe hypothermia would have broken the remaining physical grip of the men clinging to the rocks and the overturned hull. In those extra 10 minutes, the freezing depths of Superior would have claimed every single remaining soul, leaving no one alive to tell the true story of what had transpired inside the wheelhouse during the fatal midnight watch. On the foggy morning of the 4th of June 1947, the Coast Guard cutter USCGC Kimball arrived at Fort William, Ontario, carrying the freezing, oil-stained survivors of the SS Emperor. A tense silence gripped the crowded docks as family members watched the weary crew step ashore, including Frank Fish, Bill Randall, Nick Tanita, Alan Vai, Dick Wade, and Emile Savo. At the local hospital, 18-year-old Ernest Ulrich, the youngest deckhand, suffered from acute hypothermia and severely crushed hands, but doctors confirmed he would survive. In the chaotic rush to transmit news from the remote waters of Isle Royale, media outlets published rushed, unverified casualty lists. This journalistic negligence caused severe emotional whiplash for families by mistakenly swapping the names of the living and the dead. The most surreal error involved wheelsman Roger Beauchamp. Newspapers listed him as missing and presumed dead, yet he was safe at home in Windsor, Ontario. Weeks earlier, he had transferred to another vessel. But a corporate bureaucratic oversight left the ship's master roster unupdated. Once the initial shock of the disaster subsided, a rigorous, unyielding federal investigation was formally launched by marine authorities to dissect the precise mechanical and human factors of the sinking, but the Maritime Court immediately ran into an impenetrable, frustrating wall of silence. The specific individuals who held the ultimate structural authority and operational command during that fatal midnight watch, namely Captain Eldon Walkinshaw, the first mate who was supposed to be supervising the bridge, and the wheelsman on active duty had all perished in the wreck, taking the definitive answers regarding what truly transpired inside the wheelhouse down with them into the dark, frozen depths of Lake Superior. With absolutely no living bridge officers left alive to explain or defend their navigational choices, the formal Board of Inquiry ultimately placed the official blame on human error, concluding definitively that the first mate had catastrophically failed in his primary maritime duty to maintain a proper navigational watch and execute the mandatory course change required to safely clear Isle Royale. However, the federal maritime investigators did not stop at scapegoating the deceased bridge crew. They leveled a scathing, highly critical, and historic indictment against the systemic, predatory industry standards of the post-war era. The court uncovered an entrenched institutional culture of severe sleep deprivation and systemic exhaustion across the shipping industry, proving with documented evidence that Great Lakes shipping lines routinely and systematically forced their understaffed crews to perform back-breaking cargo loading and unloading operations during what should have been their legally mandated rest periods. The watchstanders on the Emperor were operating in a state of chronic, near-hallucinatory fatigue, which rendered an unmitigated disaster almost statistically inevitable under challenging conditions. Furthermore, the inquiry issued a damning, aggressive assessment of the vessel's emergency readiness, citing a complete, reckless lack of formal lifeboat drills and inadequate safety training, a systemic failure that directly explained why the port lifeboat was so easily lost to hydrodynamic suction. The final, sober tally of the tragedy was permanently carved into the annals of maritime history. 12 brave men dead, and 21 physically and emotionally scarred survivors. The eternal sleep of the SS Emperor, once celebrated as the undisputed pride of Canada, now unfolds within the deep freeze of Lake Superior's pristine, sterile depths, transforming the final resting place of this sunken giant into one of the most haunting and mathematically challenging technical diving sites on Earth. Today, at a targeted depth of 120 feet beneath the surface, the dark, turquoise-tinted waters past the lake's thermocline preserve the massive wreckage with an eerie, breathtaking fidelity. Because the year-round water temperature remains consistently near an ice-cold 39 degrees, an environment completely devoid of the wood, boring organisms and corrosive bacterial strains that rapidly consume shipwrecks in warmer, saltwater oceans, natural organic decay is effectively frozen in place. Approaching the wreckage through the deep gloom reveals a structural monument that functions as a flawless, uncorrupted time capsule of mid-20th century maritime life. The physical preservation inside the crew's living quarters defies the passage of time. The heavy wooden and metal bunk beds still stand perfectly erect within the cabins, and the wooden dresser drawers remain slightly ajar, still packed tightly with the woolen sweaters, flannel shirts, and personal belongings of the men who stood the midnight watch. Moving further into the vessel's interior, the forensic landscape of the galley is particularly astonishing. Heavy cast-iron cooking stoves, white porcelain coffee cups, and metal plates sit undisturbed on the metal countertops, frozen in the exact layout established by the ship's cook just minutes before the fatal impact. This haunting preservation creates an overwhelming psychological weight for those elite divers who successfully navigate the hazards of the site, a feeling captured perfectly by the renowned maritime historian and deep-sea explorer Gary Gentile during his meticulous photographic surveys of the hull. Gentile documented the profound, almost spiritual atmosphere of this underwater sanctuary, noting that swimming through the Emperor's locked companionways feels like stepping entirely out of linear time and entering an alternate reality. Down in that suffocating void, the absolute silence of the lake is total, broken only by the rhythmic, mechanical hiss of your own scuba regulator and the occasional, deep metallic groan of the old steel hull, shifting slightly under the immense hydrostatic pressure of the depths. It is not merely a sight, it is a heavy, wordless dialogue with the past, where the mundane items of daily life stand as quiet memorials to a crew caught completely off guard. The definitive lesson etched into the silent steel of the SS Emperor offers a sobering, fundamental truth to the global maritime industry. There was no apocalyptic autumn gale to blame, no blinding wall of ice, and no mechanical steering failure that doomed her course. The destruction of this Canadian behemoth was caused entirely by a single, catastrophic failure of human situational awareness, a watchstander navigating through the hazy, near hallucinatory exhaustion of chronic sleep deprivation, forced by predatory corporate schedules. The final, overarching warning of this freshwater graveyard is one that every contemporary mariner holds close to their heart. On the deceptive waters of Lake Superior, the ultimate trap does not always lie within the screaming fury of a November witch or the violent churning of a sudden storm. Instead, the most terrifying danger is a perfectly calm, mirror-like night. Because on these inland seas, even the absolute silence can possess a deadly, unforgiving toxicity. Finally, before concluding today's message, thank you for standing with our crew through this grim journey into the deep freeze of Lake Superior. If this raw forensic breakdown of the SS Emperor touched you, please leave a comment to share your own maritime tragic stories or thoughts. Like, share, and follow us so you never miss our new documentaries. Until we meet again on our next journey, farewell.